Hey folkies! If I tell you there is a Swedish traditional music instrument with resonance strings, you're probably gonna think, oh yes, Emelie, I know about the nyckelharpa. You have talked about that already. But then I tell you, well no, not the nyckelharpa, a fiddle. Then you're probably gonna be a little bit puzzled. Something like, well, there is the hardingfele, but it's Norwegian, right? And you just said from Sweden. And yes, the hardingfele is very much a Norwegian instrument, and you're right, I said Sweden. The instrument I mean is a fiddle with resonance strings, and very specifically from Sweden. And it is the Låtfiol, or resonance fiddle in Swedish. In this video I'm gonna present the Låtfiol, what it is, its different technicalities and variations, its history, how it came to be and developed, and also what it has become today. Part 1. What is a Låtfiol? Etymology of Låtfiol is fiol, which is fiddle in Swedish, and låt, which can be either a tune, but if you use the verb form, att låta, it means to sound. And then you get a very good idea of the name in Swedish, a sounding fiddle. And this name is in reference to the resonance strings that are the particularity of this fiddle, as they make the instrument sound more than a usual fiddle, but also sound slightly different and longer due to the resonance effect. As the difference with a hardingfele and other types of fiddles with resonance strings is not always super clear, some people, especially specialists, tend to just group them all into fioler med resonansträngar, so fiddles with resonance strings. In this video I want to talk specifically about the Swedish version of these instruments, which is the Låtfiol, in plural form låtfioler. So that's the word I'm going to use in this video. Also about the words fiddle and violin. I am talking about the instrument fiddle because we play it in folk music, but violin is the instrument when you talk about the building of it or about its playing in classical music. So I'm gonna use mostly the word fiddle when I talk about the instrument in general, but when I will talk about the instrument in the construction building sense, I might use the word violin as well. Part 2. What makes a låtfiol a låtfiol? First, as said, the resonance strings. For people who are lost about what these are, well, they are strings that you do not play on, as opposed to the melody strings, but that add some resonance to the instrument as they are tuned to specific wavelength, and when you play that wavelength on the melody strings, the two waves basically interact, so the resonance string is gonna vibrate as well even if you didn't play on it, and it adds a lot of resonance to the instrument, a little bit as if you were playing in a church, without needing to take a whole building with you. Resonance strings are found on Swedish nyckelharpa, Norwegian hardingfele, Bulgarian gadulka, but also on Baroque instruments such as viola d'amore and a few others. Then the thing is that for letting these resonance strings have their own space and pass through the instrument, the Låtfiol has a little bit of a different construction than a normal fiddle. Basically, the resonance strings are attached either to the tailpiece or to the bottom of the instrument. They go through the bridge, and then they go under the fingerboard. So the fingerboard is different from the one of a regular violin or fiddle, as it is curved and hollow. So the resonance strings can go through, then they emerge at the upper saddle with their own little saddle, and are attached to their own tuning pegs. The tuning pegs are also something that is very typical of the Låtfiol, as you will have more tuning pegs than on a regular fiddle. So here I have 4 playing strings and 2 resonant strings. And there are different ways of fitting extra tuning pegs onto a violin head. If you have a low number of resonant strings, 1, 2, maybe 3, you can use a regular head and just like put the pegs a little bit closer to each other and drill a little bit more holes, and you have to have slightly tinier pegs, but it works. But if you have a higher number of resonant strings, you will need either an elongated head, as long as you need for all the pegs that you have basically, or you can also do something that has been pretty common in history, which is to put the strings on 2 rows. Usually the melody strings on the upper row and the resonant strings on the lower row, but all possible designs exist pretty much. And låtfioler with this design of the head are nicknamed in Swedish dubbeldeckare, so double decks. Last but not least, the thing that catches the eye is very similar than on the hardingfele. It is the decorations. And I mean, it's not important for the playing, but traditionally låtfioler have been decorated. Sometimes very little to not at all. So you have some that look like regular fiddles just with extra pegs and the modifications I've just mentioned, but many have at least a little bit of decorations, quite often similar or at least inspired by the hardingfele ones. So inlays on the fingerboard and tailpiece, very often bone, and sometimes also ornated pegs or heads, carved heads, and a few other decorations. Note that the låtfioler are in principle not painted as the hardingfeles are. And this is because very often they're actually modified fiddles and not built from scratch. This also explains why they usually have similar sizes and proportions as regular fiddles and violins, as opposed to the hardingfeles, which are smaller and have a different shape. But more on the modification of regular fiddles into låtfioler a little bit later in the video. Part 3. History of the låtfiol. So what we first need to address is, where do the resonant strings come from? There are many different hypotheses. One is that good ideas tend to pop up in different regions of the world without necessarily communication between them. So the resonant strings could very well have been invented in Europe as well as in other regions of the world. But another hypothesis is that they were actually brought to Europe from India, mostly, with inspiration from instruments like the sarangi, when some European travelers to India discovered this instrument and thought that the sound was really interesting and nice, and they brought it back to Europe. In any case, the first European instruments with resonant strings are the family of the viols, so viola da gamba and so on, and it was done in England in the early 1600s. From then on, having resonance strings on stringed instruments became a fashion and spread throughout Europe. And here there is an interesting phenomenon to talk about when we talk about Scandinavia in particular. In general, many new inventions and fashions came into Scandinavia from Poland, Germany, France, Netherlands, and moved up to northern Germany, to Denmark, and on to southern Sweden, and from there spread to the rest of Scandinavia. That's the pattern for polska, for vals, but in the case of resonant strings, it's not that pattern that happened. In the 16 and 1700s, there were lots of contact, especially trade, between Great Britain and especially the west coast of Norway. So it's very possible that instruments with resonant strings were either brought in person to the west coast of Norway or just talked about by sailors and merchants and people who traveled between the two countries. And this is how probably the inspiration for the hardingfele came to be, and that's why we find hardingfele in Norway with its resonant strings. But the history of hardingfele is a very complex and debated one, so we're not gonna touch into it this time, maybe another time. But what is interesting is that hardingfele and its concept of resonant strings also spread further in Scandinavia. So probably by way of the sea and sailors and merchants again, it traveled to southern Sweden, Skåne. And this is where we find the first sources and first instruments that we can call låtfioler. What is interesting to note here and important to remember is that låtfioler are not always, and actually not very often, built from scratch. Quite often they are actually regular fiddles that are modified into låtfioler. So you take a normal regular violin and either you change a little bit the design of the head and the fingerboard, or if you want more strings and you want something a little bit more different, you can also remove the entire neck of the instrument and make a new neck that you will fasten onto the old body. And this has been quite common, not only on låtfioler, but also, for example, when Baroque violins were modified into modern violins, where the angle of the neck is slightly different. So it feels like a big thing, but it's been done quite often actually through the centuries, not only about låtfioler. And it's a way to just like get a new different instrument with possibly like extra resonant strings and so on, without having to build an entire body. So it's an economy of work and time. And many old låtfioler have traces of that. Like you can see that they have a new neck, for example, and that they have probably been modified, like they have scratches or just marks of modification. So when I say they are låtfioler here and there, they can be either one of these possibilities. So there was a hotspot in Skåne for a while for låtfioler, but then of course the good idea spread and other people started to play but also build, modify, etc. låtfioler. And this happened mostly in southern Sweden along the coastline, so you have some instruments from Blekinge, Småland, Gotland, Sörmland, and it reached Stockholm, where as you have many people, you also have more demand and more possibilities of having people who know how to build and or modify instruments. So Stockholm has also been kind of a hotspot for låtfioler. Then you have a few odd fiddles, and I think that's interesting to talk about because very often you have a center or hotspot for something, but then as the concept travels, it becomes more and more modified with the distance. So for example, the furthest låtfiol that we know of is in Røros in Norway. And here it's interesting because, well, first the instrument was said to be built only using a pocket knife, which is amazing. But also remember that the border between Sweden and Norway first has not been a border like this for a long part of history. It has moved a lot, but also it is not a musical border. The difference between Swedish and Norwegian music is more like a continuum across the border, and the big difference happens more in the high mountains where it's hard to pass. So you have more differences between eastern Norway and western Norway, so the fjord area, than between eastern Norway and Sweden, for example. This is much more similar than this. Then we have the Ångermanland låtfiol, which is the northernmost one that we know of. And here it's interesting as well because it was not really like a hotspot for låtfioler at all, but there was one man who was said to improve already existing fiddles by adding resonance strings to them. So he probably heard about resonance strings and he just like modified already existing violins. And the last one I want to talk about, which is a bit out of like the main region for låtfiol, is the tradition of låtfioler from Hälsingland. Because here, I don't exactly know if they were regular fiddles that were modified or something, but probably because there was a very specific tradition of låtfioler with just one resonance string. And it sounds a little bit odd to me. At least at first it sounded odd because I'm feeling that what's the point of having just one resonance string? It's gonna make just one note much stronger. But maybe that's what people wanted. They wanted the main key of the tunes they were playing to resonate more. Part 4. The låtfiol in recent times and nowadays. So with time, the låtfiol fell out of fashion a little bit, or rather, it was created on a wave of fashion for resonant strings, this new invention that gave instruments a very nice sound, and they sounded a bit more and a bit more church-like. But after a while, people just weren't as enthusiastic about it somehow. And maybe also other instruments became more fashionable and different types of sounds. So they were not really a thing as much, maybe. But still, they went on for centuries and unto the modern days. As quite often in instrument histories and this kind of very specific nerdy little things, what keeps a tradition going is usually just like a few people, a few independent people, like a builder or a musician. Here, mostly builders. If you just had one person who modified instruments into låtfiol somewhere, then the tradition was kept as long as this person lived, and maybe their students or friends or family or something. And this is pretty much what happened. In the hotspots and in a few places where you had some kind of tradition for låtfioler, these went on. Another parameter that is quite important is that låtfiol and fiddle are not different traditions. They are not different in their playing. Låtfioler are usually tuned in resonance tunings, so A bass or AE for example, but fiddles historically have been tuned like this too. So they are not really different. They are not on different ranges, they are not in different playing technique. It's not like the hardingfele that is its own thing somehow and doesn't really share much, neither repertoire nor technique with the fiddle that much. Of course, it's similar instruments, but they're different instruments. But a låtfiol and a fiddle are pretty much the same instrument, except that the låtfiol has resonant strings, if you see what I mean. So there has not been like a tradition of playing that instrument that is a låtfiol as opposed to the fiddle. Very often actually we have some sources of musicians who would have both and would play the låtfiol more for like ceremonies, like weddings, and then would play the regular fiddle for dancing. Probably because you can hear the resonance of the låtfiol more and it would suit more something that is a little bit more ceremonial. But fiddles were used for playing ceremonies as well, and låtfioler for dancing, very possible too. We have a few audio recordings, archives, of old fiddlers who play on låtfioler specifically. But we don't have like lines of traditions as for some repertoires or instruments. During the folk revival, some nerds and passionate people in general got interested in the låtfiol because it's one more traditional instrument of Sweden, and they started researching, studying old instruments from museums and private collections, and also building some new ones. I can cite Per Hardestam, who is quite well known for building a few låtfioler, Anders Rosén, a musician who is known for the first full album recording on låtfiol. The album is called Kärleksfiol, the love fiddle. There is also Anders Norrøde, who is both a musician, Henningarna, and a builder of instruments, and he has built and studied and restored many låtfioler. You have Magnus Gustafsson, who is a musician and historian of music, who plays on a låtfiol regularly, and a few others. I will link in the description a website by Jon Magnusson about låtfioler with compilation of so many informations about låtfioler. So both the techniques, their history. It is in Swedish, but if you just want to know like the technicalities, how many strings and where they're from, it's not hard to translate even if you don't speak Swedish. I will also link an amazing article. The name of the writer just is out of my brain for now, but I will link it on the screen. The article has actually been translated into English, so I will link the English version in the description, and it's a goldmine of information. So you can learn about the history of låtfiol and resonant string instruments in general, also the different models, different builders. It's great. If you want to spend a nerdy evening about låtfioler, well, just read that and you're gonna learn tons. It's my main source for this video. I highly recommend you to check it. What is the status of låtfiol in the Swedish folk scene nowadays? Well, it is very not well known at all. most people have never seen one, or even maybe never heard of it. I have personally met just 2 musicians who play regularly on Låtfiol that have it as their main instrument, so to say. But there are a few that navigate the folk scene, and you have also quite a good group of people who are very interested in these and publish stuff and build and modify and study and so on. There is a great Facebook group if you are interested. It's in Swedish again, but you can totally post in English there. It is called Fioler med resonansträngar, so fiddles with resonant strings, so also hardingfele and so on can be included in there, and viola d'amore and a few others. The good news, if you are interested in having your own Låtfiol, because you think it's a very good idea to have resonant strings, is that you can actually quite easily, if you are a little bit used to woodworking or instrument reparation or building, make your own. That's what I did with this one. It was a regular violin that I modified into a Låtfiol. I will explain the process in my next video, so subscribe and activate the bell if you want to get the notification for that. And I will also provide some sound samples just so that you can hear the nice resonance effect of this particular instrument. I am by no way a professional builder, but I love to dab into a bit of instrument modifications and building when I have the time and energy. This was my presentation of the Låtfiol, a very interesting instrument that I think is not talked about and not known well enough at all. So I hope I have interested a few of you in this instrument and that you will spread the knowledge and maybe get nerdy yourself. Check the links in the description for more informations and nerdy contacts with nerdy people. Don't hesitate to tell me your questions if you have any in the comments. I really like to hear directly from you, so I feel I'm talking to people and not just to like a camera. Hey camera, this is my new camera by the way. I hope the quality is better than with the old one. Let me know as well about that. And if you have any other critics or suggestions, please let me know as well. This video was actually made thanks to the suggestion of my patron Atram Perwinkle, who told me, oh, I would like to know about Låtfiol. So I just thought, what a great idea, and I made this video. By the way, supporting me on Patreon is the best way to actually support these videos, as I still don't get any money from YouTube because I'm against advertisement and I don't do collaborations nor sponsorships. I would only if it would be something I would personally really recommend, like strings or something. So if you want to support my work a little bit more substantially than likes and subscribes, which are great by the way, you can check Patreon. Link is in the description. There is where I share more behind the scenes, a bit of exclusive content, for example the sheet music for the tunes I teach in my Scandi Folk Tune series. I hope you learned something in this video. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you have a lot of good time playing, listening and sharing music, and I will see you in the next video. Hej då!